One of the best stories from the 2023 college football season so far has been the rise of the Missouri Tigers. Currently, they are 7-1, ranked inside the top 20, and have an opportunity to still make it to the SEC championship game. For those who follow the program very closely, this seemed like it was practically impossible. The narrative throughout the offseason was that Brady Cook was awful, Eliah Drinkwitz was going to be fired, and no one would be surprised if the Tigers missed a bowl game. As a Mizzou fan myself, I was skeptical. I thought they'd maybe win 6 or 7 games maximum, and all in all, I was not impressed with the direction of the program, despite some big recruiting and transfer portal wins over the last few years. But Eliah Drinkwitz and Brady Cook have made the entire Mizzou fan base eat their words, and they are currently surging to the top of college football. In today's video, I want to talk about how all that happened. We're going to talk about how the Tigers got to this point, what has made them so successful, players who have gotten them there, and why the hype may not be over just yet. Before we get started though, quickly be sure to leave a like if you want to support today's video, subscribe if you're new and love college football content, and let me know what player, team, topic, or situation I could cover next. Now let's get started and talk about the insane rise of Mizzou football. Historically, Mizzou is a very interesting program. While they've never been a blue blood by any means, they have had their fair share of good seasons, and since the turn of the century, they have been one of the more consistent programs in all of college football. You can thank former head coach Gary Pinkel for a lot of this. When he came into Mizzou from Toledo, many were skeptical of Pinkel, and after an underwhelming start to his tenure, many were already ready to send him out the door. Luckily though, the people who actually had to make decisions stood by his side, and Pinkel became the best coach in Mizzou football history. During his time there, he sent Mizzou football to a new level, had them get to multiple conference championship games, and developed a reputation of having terrific quarterback play. Brad Smith was one of the best dual-threat quarterbacks of the 2000s, Chase Daniel had legitimate Heisman hype at times, and Blaine Gabbert became a top 10 pick into the NFL. He also produced James Franklin, who got them to the SEC championship, and Drew Lock, who broke multiple SEC records at the time. Gary Pinkel was great at the quarterback position and was known for doing more with less. They were by no means the best team at recruiting, and their staff was incredible at finding hidden gems. This was most notable on the defensive line. This is the second reason why Mizzou football was so successful during that time, as they produced multiple first-round defensive linemen and some superstars who went down in conference history. Aldon Smith was absolutely insane, Shane Ray holds the all-time sack record, Michael Sam was the SEC Defensive Player of the Year, Charles Harris was a first-round pick, Justin Smith had a long NFL career, Marcus Golden was fantastic, and both Ziggy Hood and Sheldon Richardson were first-round picks. Because of D-line Mizzou always had a solid defense, and combining that with good quarterback play, they were always able to be competitive and competing near the top of the conference. Unfortunately, Pinkel's Achilles heel was Oklahoma and Texas, as he could never seemingly beat the best teams in the conference, and at times that was annoying. 2015 though was a back-breaking year for the program. There was a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes in the program in 2015. They had an absolutely awful season, and Pinkel was diagnosed with cancer. He decided to step away after the 2015 campaign, and now Mizzou would have to find their next man to keep them competitive in the SEC. That in itself is pretty fascinating, as I said earlier, Mizzou is not a blue blood program, but when the SEC decided to expand, it was both Texas A&M and Missouri who got the call. This gave Mizzou a lot more money, put them in a better conference, and gave them more national attention. While many didn't think they'd actually compete in the SEC, they proved everyone wrong, as in 2 of their first 3 years, they actually made it to the SEC championship game. The expectation now was that Mizzou could compete with the big boys, but when they made Barry Odom the head coach, they didn't realize this would set them back a few years. Going back in time, Odom actually played linebacker at Missouri from 1996 to 1999, and after that he went straight into coaching, where he spent a little bit of time at a local Missouri high school before just joining the Mizzou staff. From there he'd work his way up, and eventually went from the Mizzou safeties coach to becoming the defensive coordinator at Memphis. At the time, he was under Justin Fuente, but he would end up later taking the Virginia Tech head coaching job, and Odom would decide to go back to Mizzou as a defensive coordinator. After Pinkel left, the Tigers administration decided to promote Barry to the head coach instead of finding a potentially more qualified candidate. This would not really end up working out too well for the Tigers. While they did have a great quarterback in Drew Lock, the Tigers really struggled in the first season, as they had a losing record and couldn't really get that much going. In 2017, the Tigers would get off to an absolutely horrible start, and following a loss to Auburn, Odom famously had a speech in which he apparently burnt all the playbooks in a trash can and set it on fire. From there, Mizzou would go on a winning streak and would finish the regular season at 7-5. They'd qualify to go to the Texas Bowl, where in that game, Tom Herman famously mocked Drew Lock and was starting to get his tenure going at Texas. Mizzou had finished 7-6 and had a ton of hype for the 2018 season. Drew Lock decided to skip the NFL, and they had a couple of really talented players who were supposed to keep the Tigers near the top of the SEC. They were projected to finish 4th in the conference, but some thought they had a real chance of competing with Georgia. They get out to a strong 3-0 start before hosting the number 2 Bulldogs at home. In what was supposed to be the biggest game of Drew Lock's entire career, it was pretty underwhelming, and they ended up losing 43-29. From there, the season fell apart. They lost on the road to South Carolina, got killed on the road against Alabama, and then had one of the most heartbreaking losses in Mizzou history. At home against number 12 Kentucky, the Tigers' defense played terrific the entire game, but after a late punt return touchdown, Kentucky would have a chance to go down and score. From there, we saw one of the worst calls in college football history. As Terry Wilson threw a ball near the back of the end zone, Kentucky's receiver clearly pushed the Mizzou corner, and it was an obvious offensive pass interference or no call. Instead, though, the referees threw a flag, gave Kentucky the ball from the 2-yard line, and CJ Conrad caught a game-winning score, and Kentucky escaped Mizzou with a win. This was absolutely infuriating, as pretty much everyone agreed that was a horrible call, and that really was the epitome of the Barry Odom era. Frustrating losses, back-breaking penalties, and the inability to beat the best teams on the schedule. Ironically, the following week, Odom actually had the best win of his entire tenure, as they went on the road and beat number 11 Florida 38-17, but that was far and wide the best win of his tenure. After that, they finished the season with wins over Vanderbilt, Tennessee, and Arkansas, and they would jump to number 23 in the country and play Oklahoma State. In Drew Lock's final game, they'd lose to the Cowboys 38-33, and despite winning 8 games, it was a disappointing season. 2019 would really be the end for Barry Odom, as going into the season, there was a scandal that somewhat rocked the program, as apparently some off-the-grid tutor helped out a player, and for some reason the NCAA decided to make a statement out of it. They banned Mizzou from going to a bowl game, so the season really felt over before it got even started. To replace Drew Lock, Barry Odom tried to save the day with Kelly Bryant from Clemson, but everything really fell apart, and it started with their loss on the road to Wyoming in week 1. Well, they did bounce back with 5 straight victories. It was ultimately a very disappointing season, as they lost 5 straight games to Vandy, Kentucky, Georgia, Florida, and Tennessee, before finishing the season at 6-6 with a road victory over Arkansas. Barry Odom was fired after that Arkansas game, and it was for many reasons. He couldn't beat the big teams, had a lot of heartbreaking losses, didn't have that high of a ceiling, and I think one of the biggest factors was recruiting. He couldn't keep the best guys from St. Louis or Kansas City home, did not recruit at an SEC level, and the talent gap was just getting worse. Odom ended up being fired, and going into the 2020 season, Mizzou would end up taking a risk. Except though, they almost didn't hire Eliah Drinkwitz, they instead could have set the program back even further. Because I am a diehard Mizzou fan, I remember this quite clearly, but many probably don't know that Mizzou almost hired Blake Anderson. He was the head coach at Arkansas State at the time, and while he was decently successful and the Red Wolves have produced a few big coaches, that really was not the hire that was going to get Mizzou back on path. At the time, they were also interested in Nevada's Jay Norvell, Willie Fritz at Tulane, Jeff Monken at Army, Troy Calhoun at Air Force, and Will Healy at Charlotte. Out of all those guys, Willie Fritz would have been by far the best hire, but at the time, he was still very much an unknown, and no one knew how high of a ceiling he had. Calhoun may be the winningest guy of the bunch, but his style of football probably would not have done well at Mizzou or in the SEC. I remember after they released that initial list of coaches, the school's board of curators was not happy and told them to basically come back with a new list. I remember just laughing at the time that was released, but fortunately the board came in clutch and they came up with a new name. It was a guy by the name of Eliah Drinkwitz. Appalachian State football has been by far one of the best Group of 5 programs in all of college football, starting with their huge win in 2007 over Michigan, and then wins over both South Carolina and North Carolina in 2019. Scott Satterfield had taken the Louisville job in 2019, so the guy who was the head man for the Mountaineers was a dude named Eliah Drinkwitz. But who the heck was this guy? Well, he actually got his start at Auburn. He's one of the few head coaches who didn't play college football, but he would get his start as a quality control coach and was under both Gene Chizik and Gus Malzahn. He was apparently in charge of bringing the coffee into work each day and truly had humble beginnings. He was in a winning culture. He ended up following Malzahn to Arkansas State and got stuck in that Arkansas State coaching tree. He eventually left with Brian Harsin to go to Boise State, where he eventually was the offensive coordinator and the quarterbacks coach for the Broncos. He'd end up being hired in 2016 to go to NC State, where he coached up Ryan Finley. He was seen as one of the better young offensive minds in all of college football, and that's why Appalachian State decided to hire him ahead of the 2019 season. No one really expected anything out of him, but in his first year, the Mountaineers went 12-1, beat Louisiana in the Sun Belt Championship, and then knocked off both South Carolina and North Carolina. Many could argue that was the best season in Appalachian State history, as they beat two big-time opponents in their backyard and won a conference championship game. Throughout that 2019 season, I actually remember reading a lot about Eliah Drinkwitz, and I was very intrigued where he was going to go next. It ended up being a very pleasant surprise for me when it started to come out that Drinkwitz was the front-runner for the Mizzou job. Eventually, he'd make that official on December 9th of 2019, and I remember immediately I felt a sense of hope. Drinkwitz was a young coach who had a ton of energy, could recruit, was hopefully going to turn around the offensive side of the ball, and make Mizzou more relevant both on the football field and in the media. That would happen pretty quickly, as immediately he started the new Zoo slogan and went viral for winning a recruiting battle with Alabama. Ennis Rakestraw was one of the fastest rising recruits in the class of 2020, and after it being down to Bama and Mizzou, he eventually committed to the Tigers, and there's a famous video of him running around the office screaming, showing the kind of energy and tenacity he would bring to the recruiting trail.
Oh my God! Oh my God! Yes!
Family, that's what he do.
Interestingly enough, that coach that Drinkwitz hugged at the end of the video is Ryan Walters, who also played a part in revitalizing Mizzou and is now the head coach at Purdue. Many other SEC fans laughed at this, but it was just the kind of culture change that Mizzou needed. Instead of Barry Odom, who was lucky to even land 1 or 2 4-stars in a class and show any sort of enthusiasm. This is no diss on Odom though, as he's done marvelous work at UNLV, as currently the Runnin' Rebels are 6-1, and that is not an easy place to win, so hats off to him. So now that we are talking about the Drinkwitz era, how has he solved the problem? Well, before this year, it was tough sledding for him. Well, going into the 2020 season, there was not a whole lot of expectation for Mizzou football, and with everything going on in the world, people were just happy to have the Tigers even playing. They projected to finish 6th in the SEC East, but to most people's shock, they actually did a little bit better. But it was going to be pretty difficult at first. Drinkwitz's first game as a Mizzou coach would come against number 2 Alabama. Former big-time quarterback from TCU Sean Robinson would make the start, but he would later get benched in favor of a redshirt freshman by the name of Connor Bazelak. He was a former 4-star recruit in the class of 2019, and by the end of that game, many knew that he was going to be the quarterback of the future for Eli. The following week, they went on the road and lost 35-12 to Tennessee, and despite the 0-2 start, there was still some relative optimism around the program. In week 3, they would host number 17 LSU, and this game was a huge deal. In a game full of offensive fireworks, Connor Bazelak would lead Mizzou to a late touchdown, and they would go up 45-41. LSU would eventually go all the way down the field, and Mizzou stopped the Tigers 4 straight times on the goal line to win 45-41. While LSU was not the team we all thought they were, this was still a ginormous win and the first big signature victory of the Drinkwitz era. After that, they followed it up with a win over Kentucky before getting blown out by Florida. From there, they won 3 straight SEC games, including victories over South Carolina and Vanderbilt, and a huge rivalry win over Arkansas. The Razorbacks apparently also really wanted Eli Drinkwitz, but got Sam Pittman instead. So these two programs had been going back and forth, and Drinkwitz got the last laugh, and this was punctuated by a game-winning field goal by their freshman kicker Harrison Mevis. From there, they'd be ranked number 25 in the country before they get blown out by number 9 Georgia. They'd finish the season with a 51-32 loss to Mississippi State, and while they did qualify to play in a bowl game against Iowa, that game was eventually canceled. The Tigers went 5-5 in year 1, and for the most part, they beat everybody who they were supposed to beat and lost the games they were supposed to lose. Going into 2021, Drinkwitz was starting to show that he could recruit. He landed a few big-time players, including one of the top offensive tackles in the country, Connor Tollison, a superstar receiver in Dominic Lovett, one of the fastest rising quarterbacks in the country in Tyler Macon, and a kid by the name of Makai Wingo. The recruiting class itself was pretty solid, but he also did a lot of work in the transfer portal. He ended up bringing in former top 100 receiver from Ohio State, Mookie Cooper, a Caleb Evans, a corner from Tulsa who eventually made it to the NFL, and then a big-time offensive lineman from Oklahoma. With Connor Bazelak back at quarterback, Tyler Beatty back at running back, and a couple of key defensive players, many believed that Mizzou could build upon their 2020 success. Unfortunately, it did not go as planned. After beating Central Michigan in week 1, they went on the road to Kentucky in week 2 and lost 35-28. I was personally at that game, and it wasn't as close as the score indicated, and Mizzou's defense was absolutely horrible. Steve Wilkes was their defensive coordinator at the time, and while he has been an NFL head coach a couple times, his scheme was not working at the college level. The defense was absolutely horrible, which eventually led to losses to both Boston College and Tennessee, and teams were putting up insane amount of points on the Tigers. Texas A&M won 35-14, North Texas put up 35 points, and Tennessee put up 62 points. They'd finally get their first SEC victory of the year against Vanderbilt, and at this time they were 4-4. They'd need to win 2 of their last 4 games if they wanted to make it to a bowl game, and after a loss to number 1 Georgia, they really needed to figure it out. Luckily, they ended up beating South Carolina at home, and then took care of Florida in overtime. Instead of electing to play for a second overtime though, Connor Bazelak found his tight end in the back of the end zone, and they had a walk-off winner. This got the Tigers to bowl eligibility, and was more importantly an exciting home win. After that, they'd lose on the road to number 25 Arkansas, before qualifying to play in the Armed Forces Bowl. By this time, Connor Bazelak was so banged up that he had stopped playing and was going to enter the transfer portal. That meant it was time for Brady Cook to step up. Despite putting up 2 touchdowns, Mizzou ended up scoring a touchdown a little bit too quickly, and they lost 24-22 to Army by way of a game-winning field goal. The Tigers went 6-7, and that loss to Army was no fun. 2022 was supposed to be one of the best seasons yet for the Tigers. Eliah Drinkwitz had landed the number 15 recruiting class in the country, which was headlined by some star power. They brought in Luther Burden III, who was the number 2 receiver in the country and a 5-star player, top 100 quarterback in Sam Horn, and a plethora of other 4-star players who eventually could see the field. In terms of the transfer portal, they also brought in a couple of key players, which included Tyron Hopper from Florida, Nathaniel Pete, a running back from Stanford, Drayden Norwood, a corner from Texas A&M, and most importantly, relatively unknown running back from Truman State by the name of Cody Schrader. He was one of the top running backs in all of college football, but no one even knew about him. He originally started as a walk-on, but by the end of the year, he had become one of the Tigers' most important players. Mizzou would start out the season with a win over Louisiana Tech before an embarrassing blowout on the road against K-State in Week 2. Many were starting to feel the flames under Eliah Drinkwitz, and a win over Abilene Christian did nothing to make that any better. In Week 4, they traveled to Auburn, who at the time was also a dumpster fire, and they had one of the worst finishes in the history of college football. After completing a pass to Dominic Lovett, kicker Harrison Mevis pushed his field goal wide right, and they'd have to go to overtime. They bailed out Auburn with an offsides on a missed field goal, and then when it was their turn on offense, they had an even worse screw-up. Nathaniel Pete took the ball and was about to score a touchdown, but as he was reaching forward, threw the ball through the end zone, and Auburn won. It was one of the most embarrassing games of the 2022 season for any team, and a horrible loss for Drinkwitz. After that, though, he showed a glimmer of hope, as they were leading number 1 Georgia for the majority of the game, but eventually the Bulldogs pulled through and won 26-22, and Mizzou couldn't get the upset. After that, they went on the road to Florida and lost to Anthony Richardson, and the Tigers were now 2-4. It looked like Drinkwitz was no longer going to make it, but he figured out a way to rally the troops and get them back to a bowl game. It started with a 3-point win over Vanderbilt, a 13-point win over number 25 South Carolina, and then wins over New Mexico State and Arkansas. Between those games was a horrible blowout loss to number 5 Tennessee, and a loss to Kentucky, which was also somewhat controversial, as there was a terrible roughing the punter call that eventually led to an NCAA rule change. It doesn't really matter though. The Tigers ended up playing in a bowl game against Wake Forest, in which they lost 27-17. They once again went 6-7, and it was time for them to figure something out. Brady Cook was below average as a running back, and the offense was just not fun to watch at all. Defensive coordinator Blake Baker had become one of the best young defensive minds in the game, and pretty much the entire Mizzou defense came back, so there was a decent amount of hype for 2023. Unfortunately though, the offense is what everyone was wondering about. Their top receiver Dominic Lovett decided to transfer to Georgia, but the Tigers brought in talent to replace him. They signed 2 of the top tight ends in the country, brought in a 4-star quarterback, and in the transfer portal, made a couple of splashes. They brought in one of the top offensive tackles in the country in Cameron Johnson, former 5-star quarterback from Miami Jake Garcia, and former 5-star Oklahoma receiver Theo Weiss. As it's played out today, Weiss has actually been a lot better than Lovett this year, and it paved the way for their superstar receiver Luther Burden to take over. While there was somewhat of a quarterback battle at first between Sam Horn, Jake Garcia, and Brady Cook, Cook ended up winning the job rather quickly, and new offensive coordinator Kirby Moore was hoping to save his career and build Mizzou back up. How did it start out? Well, it was not great at first. In Week 1, the Tigers would take on FCS South Dakota on Thursday night, and in that game, they came out firing. They had a tremendous first half and won 35-10. In Week 2, they get a chance to host Middle Tennessee at home. The Blue Raiders famously beat Mizzou in 2016 for their homecoming game, so this was not going to be an easy matchup or a gimme victory. That is exactly how it played out, as the Tigers ended up winning 23-19, but almost completely blew the game. They had to rely on their defense at the end, and at that point, Mizzou fans were selling all stock on Eliah Drinkwitz and the offense. There had been absolutely no change through the first 2 games, but luckily, Week 3 is when Kirby Moore and Mizzou football would burst onto the national scene. For some reason, I always know when to go to college football games, as I decided to drive to Columbia, Missouri for this game. In what was one of the most thrilling games of the entire season so far, Mizzou went back and forth with K-State and eventually set themselves up for a monumental victory. They got the stop and drove all the way to K-State's side of the field and were going to kick a game-winning field goal. Unfortunately, they had some stupid clock management, so it pushed it even further back. This was going to be a 60-plus yard field goal, but Harrison Mevis hit it. It barely snuck past the upright, and Furrow Field went absolutely crazy.
Mevis kick on the way. It's good!
The Tigers won 30-27, upset the number 15 Wildcats, and were now headed for a breakout year. In week 4, they'd play in a neutral site game in St. Louis against Memphis, and they won that game 34-27 after a late Memphis score. They controlled their first 4 games of the season, and Brady Cook was playing great. They were ranked number 23 for their road victory over Vanderbilt, and then had a huge matchup at home at number 23 LSU. Could Drinkwitz beat the Tigers again? Well, it wouldn't end up happening. Despite getting off to a fast start, Mizzou's defense was really nowhere to be found in the second half, and eventually Jaden Daniels really got going and scored a late touchdown to go up 3. From there, Brady Cook threw a pick 6, and while the Tigers lost by 10, it was a close game that went down to the final minute. This was definitely a tough blow for Mizzou, and after the first quarter against Kentucky, many thought all the momentum in the season was practically going to be over. Number 24 Kentucky jumped out to a 14-point lead, but then there was a play that changed the trajectory of the game and potentially of the season. Inside Kentucky territory, Mizzou's punter took the ball and threw it down the field to freshman receiver Marquise Johnson, and he scored. But from there, the script completely flipped, and they beat Kentucky 38-21, throwing Devin Leary into the turf play after play, and showing that when they got punched in the mouth, they could respond. Mizzou now jumped back into the polls and were set to play South Carolina at home. In this game, they pretty much controlled it from the very opening snap and won 34-12. Now, the Tigers are 7-1. They're currently ranked number 16 in the country, are 3-1 in the SEC, have one of the top offenses in the country, and are setting up for a monumental game against Georgia. They have a bye week this upcoming weekend, but from there, they have to travel to Athens. At times, Georgia has looked beatable this year. The only reason they beat Auburn was because of their superstar tight end Brock Bowers, and with him being injured, I feel like this game is actually going to be somewhat close. While I would not put money on Mizzou to win, I think it'll be closer than the experts think, and if they can somehow pull it off, it'll be one of the biggest wins in school history, and Mizzou could still have an outside chance at making the college football playoff. It's likely not going to happen, but one can dream. The last time Mizzou won in Athens was 2013, when they beat number 6 Georgia between the hedges, and Mizzou would end up going to the SEC championship game that year. One of the main reasons Mizzou was so good in 2013 was because of a good defense and some offensive star power. That is exactly what has happened this year, as Brady Cook is one of the top quarterbacks in the country. He's thrown for 2,200 yards with 15 touchdowns and only 3 interceptions, and Cody Schrader has become one of the top backs in the country as well. He's run for 807 yards and 9 touchdowns, and the receivers have really stepped up. They have a 4-headed monster in Theo Weiss, Mookie Cooper, Marquise Johnson, and Luther Burden III, and Burden could potentially be a first-team All-American. He already has 60 catches for nearly 900 yards and 6 touchdowns, and there are still 5 or 6 more games to be played at least. On defense, Tyrone Hopper has become one of the best tacklers in the country, and Chris Abrams-Drain could potentially be the best defensive back in all of college football. Darius Robinson has been tremendous on the defensive line, and both him and Johnny Walker are also 2 of the best pass rushers in the country. Kirby Moore has proved to be a great first-year offensive coordinator, Blake Baker is one of the top DCs in the nation, and Drinkwitz is finally putting it all together. In terms of their 2024 recruiting class, they've already landed one of the top players in the nation in Williams Winery, who's the number 3 recruit overall, and many are thinking that they're also going to land the number 8 recruit in the country, which is wide receiver Ryan Wingo. Mizzou's recruiting really well. She once again grabbed a lot of talent out of the portal, and has finally been able to put it all together. As a Mizzou fan, it has been awesome to watch, the season has been thrilling, and I hope it is not over yet. But what do you guys think? If you're a Mizzou fan, what did I get right and wrong? What do you think of this year's team? And what has made the Tigers so successful? Be sure to let me know down below. Let me know what team, topic, or situation I should cover next. And before you go, don't forget to check out all my other videos on the end screen, including my video about the rise of Louisville football. I hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.